Okay, I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Alicia Bartlett, the Manager of Planning and Engineering. This spring, the City of Brooks put out an RFP to have our offsite levy bylaw reviewed and a report rewritten. Corvus Business Advisors was the successful proposal. And so we have today Greg Weiss here, who's the president of Corvus Business Advisors, and he will be doing a presentation on our new offsite levies.
Thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon, everyone. Perhaps what we could just do before we start, I see there's a few members of the public that have joined us, and maybe you could just very quickly introduce yourself and let us know which organization you're with. Jeff, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. Hi, Greg. My name is Jeff Tiffin, and I'm the Manager of Planning, Development, and Engineering with the County of Newell.
Welcome, Jeff. Thank you. Maria Jackson.
Hi, I'm Maria, and I'm also with the County of Newell. I'm the Supervisor of Planning and Development.
Welcome, Maria. And then I see that there is another user, but I don't see a name on screen, so I'm not sure what your name is.
Oh, that could be me. I'm Marissa Wardrop. I'm a counselor with the City of Brooks. I'm zooming in today.
Ah, okay. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, from joining us. So it seems like other than the two members from the county, there are no other members from the public participating, but that's okay, just in case there are. We're going to go through this presentation in its entirety anyways. I anticipate that my presentation will probably take, well, it shouldn't be no more than 45 minutes. In terms of what I'm going to be covering, I'm going to talk about the city's current bylaw very quickly. I'm talking a little bit about offsite levies in general and the associated legislation and regulations. And then we'll get into the specifics of the City of Brooks in terms of development areas, the infrastructure and the costs, and then obviously a summary and the rates, which is what this is all about. I've also got a comparison of those rates to some other communities that I'll share. And once I'm done my sort of formal piece of the presentation, I'll open up the floor to any members, any questions from members of the public. And so I would ask that you hold your questions till the end. I've done many of these presentations, and I find that most questions are probably answered by the time I get to the end of the presentation. But if there are any, I'd be happy to take them. And after that Q&A session, we'll adjourn and then let any members of the public depart at that point. And then I'll stay on with administration and council if you like, and if we can talk about next steps or any other questions that you have at that point. So with that, then I'm going to start. Again, my name is Greg Weiss, and my company's name is Corvus Business Advisors. Our firm specializes in financial services for municipalities. So specifically, three primary services. We deal with offsite levy rate development, water and sewer utility rates, and annexation financial impact assessments. The model that I'll be showing you a glimpse of a little bit later on, the offsite levy model, is actually now in place and being used in over 45 municipalities across Alberta. So it's become a bit of a benchmark in our province. Let me talk a little bit about the city's current offsite levy bylaw. The current bylaw was established in 2006. And it specifies and contains rates associated with four types of infrastructure: water, sewer, stormwater, and transportation infrastructure. At the time, the city established the rates on a kind of a differentiated basis, and in part on a per dwelling unit basis, rates are charged, and that's done on a sort of an odd decreasing scale based on density. And then there are also some additional rates that are applied to commercial, industrial, and institutional kinds of development. And those rates are on a net hectare basis. In addition, the bylaw at the time also included rates associated with non-residential development, or fees really, other development fees that were assessed based on the size of the building, so on a per square meter basis. As Alicia mentioned at the outset, this project was initiated to accomplish a few things. First of all, to update the bylaw and bring it current. It's very much out of date, as you can imagine. The rates are very much out of date. And in so doing and updating that bylaw, the city was interested in ensuring that the framework for rates was based on leading practices. So focus solely, for example, on offsite levies. The components dealing with other elements such as development permits were to be removed. We want to ensure that rates were charged consistently on a net hectare basis at the time of subdivision and development, which of course is in alignment with the Municipal Government Act, etc. So those are some of the objectives associated with this project. I'll touch a little bit more on these pieces in a moment. Let me talk a little bit about offsite levies in general, and in particular, who pays for what. You've probably heard the term that development should pay for development. It's a bit of a misnomer. Development certainly should pay for their share of development, but municipalities also pay a portion as well. And that's how the law in Alberta has been struck. It was struck to create a reasonable balance between those costs that are paid by the municipality or by end users and the community as a whole. We think about them in a few buckets. If you can think about capital costs, developers indeed should be paying for their share of the capital costs required to support their development. And that includes both hard and soft capital costs. What we mean by hard costs are things like the water, sewer, storm, and roads. And that there are also certain soft capital costs that are now included in the legislation, recreation, fire halls, and the like. But regardless of whether it's hard and soft, that infrastructure is turned over to the municipality, and the municipality has to operate and maintain that infrastructure for its life. And so it's the taxpayer that ends up paying for those operation and maintenance costs associated with that infrastructure. And at the end of its useful life, that infrastructure also has to be replaced. And again, it's the municipality or the taxpayer that is responsible for replacing that infrastructure. So there is a balance in Alberta in terms of who pays for what. I wanted to sort of talk about how offsite levies work from the perspective of what happens when development occurs. When a developer develops a piece of land, they are responsible for paying all the costs of all the infrastructure that is needed to support that development. And there are two kinds. The first kind is the infrastructure that is located on the piece of land that is being developed. And we can think of that like the local road network, the local water distribution system, etc. And because that infrastructure is located on the land that is being developed, it is referred to as on-site infrastructure. That infrastructure is usually constructed and paid for by private developers and then turned over to the municipality to operate and maintain. But there is also infrastructure that is critical for that land developing that is located away from the land itself. Things like the arterial road network, the water treatment facilities, the sewage treatment facilities, the major trunks and transmission lines that get the water and receive the sewer, etc. All that infrastructure is located away from the land, and because it is referred to as off-site infrastructure. And it is also the developer's responsibility to pay for their share of that off-site infrastructure. And that's, of course, what the topic of today's discussion is all about. Not on-site infrastructure, but off-site infrastructure. And regardless, no matter what the developer's costs are, whether they're building and constructing on-site infrastructure or whether they're paying for their share of off-site infrastructure, ultimately they will pass those costs along to the end users, if you will, of that land. In Alberta, the legislation associated with off-site levies can be found in Section 648 of the Municipal Government Act. Some key things as it pertains to the legislation. First of all, off-site levies are only applicable as they pertain to new infrastructure only, not maintenance or rehabilitation or replacement of the infrastructure, new only. And the legislation has undergone some changes over the years. Prior to 2004, the legislation was focused on only on three kinds of infrastructure: water, sewer, and stormwater related infrastructure. Then in 2004, the MGA was amended to include road related or transportation related infrastructure. And then most recently, and you're probably all familiar with this, just about now 4 years ago in 2017, the government of the day added 4 new types of infrastructure to the legislation: recreation facilities, fire halls, police stations, and libraries. When a municipality collects an off-site levy for one of these new kinds of infrastructure, it can only do so once and only once, when that land is either developed or subdivided. And the municipality can never go back and collect again on that particular piece of land once it has paid. So as the old saying goes, once the horse is out of the barn, you can't put it back into the barn. And the funds that the municipality collects for these off-site levies must be accounted for separately from other funds. And those funds earn interest. And most importantly, those funds can only be used for the purpose, the specific purpose for which they were collected. In other words, the municipality collects water levies. Those water levies can only be used to construct water off-site infrastructure that is reflected in the bylaw. You can't take water levies, for example, and build and pay for sewer infrastructure. There's also a series of regulations that have been established by the provincial government. They are referred to as AR 187-2017. 2017 because that's the last time they were updated. And there's a whole host of regulations. I'm not going to read through all of them here yet, but they really mostly focus on how the levy should be set up. There's very little in the way of information in terms of how to manage and coordinate levies once they are established by bylaw. So it's all about how they are to be set up. I'll touch on a couple of them. The fourth bullet down, you see there's a shared responsibility between the municipalities and developers for defining the infrastructure requirements. And that's typically fostered through the regular update of a municipality's master plans. When a master plan is updated, typically there is input sought from the development community at that point regarding the composition of those master plans, the projects, when they're going to be built, et cetera, et cetera. The methodology, this is the 7th bullet down, the methodology that a municipality uses must be applied consistently across the municipality. You have to use the same methodology to calculate the rates. Now that does not mean to say that rates need to be the same in every area, they don't. But how you determine those rates should be consistent. There are a few items that I've highlighted here in red, and those were some of the items that were newly added to the regulations in 2017. The first one, as you can say, deals with keeping rates current. Off-site levies have to be kept current. And the reason is because the information that goes into calculating the rates does not stay static, it is forever changing. pace of development is changing, and obviously the capital plans upon which the costs are based, those are also changing regularly. And so a municipality has an onus, a duty to keep those rates up to date. And in the regulations and legislation in 2017, they talk about the requirement now for, in fact, a periodic review and an annual report to council outlining the status and situation of offsite levies. The second bullet from the bottom, which also has some pieces outlined in red there, deals with the infrastructure that was newly added to the legislation in 2017, that being recreation, fire, police, and library infrastructure. And basically what it says is that there is some additional rigor that is required in establishing those kinds of rates. Basically, almost a business plan needs to be created that talks about the need for the infrastructure and how much of the cost of that infrastructure will ultimately be the responsibility of new development to pay for via offsite levies. Now, quite frankly, most of our clients, almost all of our clients, have already been sort of following that basic rigor in the establishment of all of its levies, but it wasn't until 2017 that this actually came into force as it relates to these new pieces. And in fact, some of these regulations I've highlighted for you on this slide were transferred from the regulation itself to Section 648 when the government made its recent amendments, and that was back in June just of this year. But essentially, the commentary is the same. So I talked a little bit about the Corvus offsite levy model earlier. This offsite levy model, myself and my partner at the time built in around 2006. And it evolved from that point. And as I said, it's now in place in over 45 municipalities. We're not going to be getting into the details of the model itself. That's not what today's presentation is all about. But I at least wanted to show you and give you a snapshot of what the control panel looks like. This is the city's offsite levy model that we have constructed for them. You'll notice in the center there are 8 columns, essentially, 1 column for each infrastructure type in the legislation: transportation, water, sanitary, storm, rec, fire, police, and library. Now, just because the legislation has 8 kinds of infrastructure types that are allowed, it does not mean to say that a municipality has to include all 8 types in their bylaws. They don't. And in fact, most municipalities in Alberta don't. There are only a handful that have started to add some of those soft infrastructure types that I described earlier. For this project, and in the city's bylaw, we'll be focusing on 4 of the infrastructure types, and those are the same 4 that exist in the bylaw currently, that being transportation infrastructure, water, sewer, and stormwater. So, at its most very basic level, an offsite levy rate is relatively simple. You have costs that are in the numerator, and you have land development in the denominator. You divide the costs by the land, and you come up with a rate per hectare. Now, that's a very simplistic view. There are other factors that very much have an influence on the rates, but at its most basic form, that's what it is. I'm going to start today by talking about the denominator, that being land development. So one of the things that we do with all municipalities when we do one of these projects is we have to divide the community up into a number of offsite levy areas. And those areas are based on the boundaries associated with the various infrastructure basins. When the municipality's engineering firm or engineering advisor creates the master plan for the community, they'll, depending on the infrastructure, separate it into a number of basins. And we use those basin boundaries to set up the various offsite levy areas. for the city of Brooks, there are 25 off-site levy areas. And you can see those 25 areas listed down the left-hand side of the table at the bottom. The other thing that you need to be aware of is when we do these reviews and establish rates, we are looking at things over a 25-year review period. The Corvus offsite levy model is based on a 25-year review period. That 25-year review period aligns very nicely with the capital plan scope, including implementation, that most municipalities make use of. More importantly, it aligns very nicely with the economic life of many of the assets contained in those master plans. And lastly, it aligns with a very normal repayment period for infrastructure in general. And so you can see for our review here, the 25 years starts in 2021 and goes out to 2045. The next thing that we ask the community to do is to determine how much land is available across all of these 25 areas. And you can see that there is about 1,675 hectares of land. However, a good portion of that has already been developed to date in Brooks. Just over 1,000 hectares of land has already been developed. And that's all interesting, but really what I'm interested most about is how much land is forecast to develop in our 25-year review period. And that...
I get a...
Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback here. It's coming from the one Zoom user account. If I could ask you just to put your on mute, that's be much appreciated. Thank you. So as I said, what's really most important is how much land is anticipated to develop in our 25-year review period. And for that, we turn to the planners within the municipality. And as all planners do, they'll look at the local circumstances of the community to make that forecast. How quickly is the population growing? What's the economy doing? What are developers telling the municipality in terms of planned developments in the area, et cetera, et cetera. And so the planners will pull out their crystal ball and they will make their forecast. And you can see that in Brooks, it's anticipated that there will be about 180 hectares of land that develops over that review period, about 11% of all the land. That's what's anticipated to develop. And that's this area in yellow that you see here down below. So the planners have done that for each area. Now you may be asking yourself, well, isn't it difficult to forecast land accurately over a 25-year period? And the answer is yes, it's virtually impossible to get it exactly right. But you have to remember the key thing here is this plan does not stay static for the review period. In fact, and this goes back to the legislation, the MGA, it gets updated annually. So really, this is not a 25-year forecast, but really it's a one-year forecast that is updated every year. And this will be adjusted to reflect the new realities of the day every year when this is amended. So there's about 180 hectares of land that's anticipated to develop, and that helps to form the denominator of our rate calculation. I'm now going to turn to the numerator, to the cost side of things. And again, there are 4 types of infrastructure that I'm going to take you through: water, sewer, stormwater, and transportation. For the water, for the first one, I'm going to go through this in detail so that you can see how these various pieces fit together. But so I don't eat up the entire afternoon, then I'm going to go very quickly through the other 3 infrastructure types, because the process is exactly the same for each infrastructure type. What changes is the actual projects themselves and their costs. All right, let's talk about or look at water first. So in Brooks, the city has about 15 water projects that are off-site levy in nature. And the total cost of those projects is just over $36 million. Now, cost is comprised of three pieces. There's the cost of the projects that have been completed up to this point in time being the end of 2020. There is the financing costs, future financing costs associated with that construction, if there is any. And thirdly, there is the future capital costs that are going to occur in the 25 years. And this is the piece we tend to think of most often. This is basically the capital plan, the water capital plan, at least as it relates to off-site water infrastructure. And when you bring those three pieces together, then you get the total cost, which is just over about $36 million. And those costs, you should know, include engineering costs, they include contingencies, and if there's any land component, the land cost, it is also included in there. The second thing that you should note is if there are any historical financing costs, if there were, for example, a debenture and there were interest charges associated with that, they are built into the historical, total historical costs. So $36 million of infrastructure. From that, we have to take away, before we calculate rates, we have to subtract a few things, those being costs that are being paid for by others, essentially. There are two key things here that we hone in on. Were there any special earmarked grants that were received or will be received for any of these projects? And for water infrastructure in Brooks, there's about $3.5 million of special grants. Special grants are things like grants from the Alberta Water Wastewater Partnership. We're not talking about MSI monies or other grants that are the municipalities. Okay, those are not earmarked, those are the municipalities' monies. We're talking about only earmark related grants here. And were there any contributions that were received from any of that infrastructure? And you can see that there was about $1.7 million for water infrastructure. When we subtract those from the total cost, we end up with a net or reduced cost of just under $31 million for the water infrastructure. And now we're ready to allocate that $31 million to either existing development or future development. And let's look at that coming up here in a moment. What will help us determine that allocation in some respects will be the timing of some of that infrastructure. And so we have to know what that timing is. And the reason that that is important is because that timing will allow us to segregate certain costs. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at this timeline down at the bottom of the slide, once again, the review period that we are looking at is 25 years. And so that's this blue line that you see here, year 1 out to year 25. If a project was built prior to year 1 or up to year 1, well then 100% of its costs then are found in our rates. However, if a project is going to be built in the future, to be fair to the development community, we prorate those costs depending on when the project is going to be built. So, for example, if a project is going to be built here about a third of the way along our review period, then there are about 2/3 of the costs that will find their way into rates. If a project here is going to be built at about year 20 of our review period, well, then only about 20% of the costs are in the rates. And if a project is going to be built beyond our review period, well, there are no costs that are within our rates. And when I say not within our rates, I mean today. Remember, this 25-year review period does not stay static. Each year, when the model is updated, it looks out 1 year further. And so any costs that are out beyond our review period that are allocated to developers will gradually find their way into the rates as time proceeds. So this table here on the right-hand side just shows you the construction start year, the construction completion year either for those projects that have already been completed or those that will be done in the future associated with the city of Brooks. So you take one of these projects, for example, that was constructed back in 2006, well, 100% of those costs are in rates. If you take one of these projects that is going to be built during our review period, for example, in 2029, well, there'll only be a portion of those costs that are within rates. So as I said, the net cost of all of the water projects in Brooks is about $31 million. And we're now set to allocate those to the parties that benefit. What I mean by that is there are three potential groups or parties that we can allocate costs to. First of all, a large portion, obviously, will potentially benefit the existing municipality. This would be the portion allocated then to the city of Brooks itself. And this allocation, by the way, is created when the project is added to the bylaw. Whenever the amount is determined at that point in time, it does not change from that point forward. Secondly, there could also be a share that is allocated to another stakeholder being a neighboring municipality. There might be, for example, as you can imagine, an arterial road that runs along the boundary of your municipality. And in that case, the neighboring municipality would have a benefit from that road and would pay for a share of that road. There isn't any in this particular case, but there might be. Then the last two columns, both of them pertain to that portion of the infrastructure which gets allocated to future development. And this future development, we separate into two pieces. That portion which is beyond our review period, which I just discussed a moment ago, and that portion which is in our review period. This is the very last column. And this is the portion, again, that is going to form the offsite levy rate. The portion of costs that we're allocating to developers in the future that is within our review period. And once we know, and this is the most important column, this is what we're going to be using, when we take these percentages in the last column, multiply them by these net costs, we're going to get the developer's costs. And when we do that, you can see that the developer's costs are about $7.3 million for water infrastructure in the city of Brooks. That's great, but we're not quite ready to calculate the rates just yet. We have to do one more thing with the costs, and that is we have to subtract from those costs any levies that we have already collected from developers. And so up to the end of 2020, you can see that the city of Brooks has collected nearly $2.5 million from the development community as it pertains to water infrastructure. And when I subtract that from the total, we end up with a final adjusted cost for water infrastructure of about $4.8 million. That's the number that forms the numerator of our rate calculation. So just to sort of summarize what I described for you in a more simple manner, let's just follow this flow chart through. On the water side, the city of Brooks has about $36 million of infrastructure that has either been built already or will be built in the future. Minus about $5.3 million in special grants and contributions leaves a balance of about $31 million. Of that $31 million, the city itself, based on existing development, their share is about $18.7 million. Zero of it has been allocated to any other municipalities. And then these two gray boxes are the portions that are allocated to future development. However, a sum of that, about $4.9 million, is beyond our review period and therefore not in our rates right now. $7.3 million is within our review period, minus what we have already collected today of about $2.5 million, leaves a balance of about $4.8 million of water infrastructure. And just to repeat what I said earlier, This portion that is beyond our review period right now, $4.9 million, this is also a share allocated to developers, but it will find its way into the rates in the future as the model is updated each year. So now that we know what the costs are associated with water infrastructure in Brooks and how much is being allocated to developers in our 25-year review period, we are now able to and need to tell the model where to allocate those costs. Earlier, I showed you the map of the city of Brooks, and there are 25 offsite levy areas that have been defined, and you can see those areas from 1 through 25 on the top of this table. And how the Corvus model works is if the project, in this case, project 1 in the first row, if that project benefits an area, we tell the model it benefits by putting a little number 1 in the cell. If the cell is lit up with a number 1, the model knows that it has to allocate a portion of the cost of the project to that specific area. And if the cell is blank, then the model knows that it does not allocate any cost to that area. And as one can imagine, you can see water infrastructure is typically treated, it's very similar to roads in that there is typically one large loop system, if you will. And that's why most of the projects here are allocated to all areas in the city. If you look at the Corvus report and you turn to sewer and stormwater infrastructure, you can see that it's much more spotty in terms of what infrastructure, what benefits which areas, because sewer infrastructure and storm infrastructure, of course, is very much gravity dependent. And so only certain lands benefit from certain infrastructure. The road network or the arterial road network in a community is typically allocated to all areas. It does not matter where you live, you benefit from the arterial road network in the community. So those are the allocations for water infrastructure. The last thing that we have to talk about that impacts rates, that goes beyond just costs and land, and that is the status of the offsite levy account for that infrastructure. If the account has a big surplus, then obviously that will have an effect on rates positively. If the account is in deficit significantly, well, that too will have an impact on rates. That will have the impact of increasing rates. So we have to understand and we have to manage the offsite levy account balances within the model. At the end of 2020, as it relates to water, the city's records indicated that the various water accounts, and I say accounts because there were at least several water accounts in the city. Together, they had a balance of about $763,000. Now, that balance is applicable only to offsite levy related transactions. Those accounts the city has also included other non-offsite levy related transactions, and for this analysis in this review, those were removed, and we'll talk about those a little bit later on. Now, that $763,000 balance, you have to understand that that balance does not include any front-ending that was done by the city up to the end of 2020. Just to remind everybody what front-ending is, when a particular piece of infrastructure needs to be built and paid for, if the account, the developer's levy account, does not contain enough funds to pay for the developer's share of the infrastructure, what often will happen is the municipality will pay for the entire project and then collect back on that outlay later on in the form of levy collections. That initial upfront payment by the municipality of the for the developer's portion of the costs is referred to as front-ending. And when you factor in the front-ending that has been done by the city of Brooks for water infrastructure, the account balance is actually not 763,000. The account balance is actually in deficit about 365,000. So if you look down here in the table, up to the end of 2020, the city of Brooks had front-ended approximately $1.13 million of water infrastructure. And so what the model automatically does is it says, well, if there is an obligation due to the municipality and there are any funds that are available in the account, those funds should be used to reduce that obligation down. And that's what has occurred here. When you transfer that $763,000 out of the levy account and use it to pay down a portion of that $1.13 million obligation, what you are left with then is an obligation in the future of about $365,000. So as it relates to water infrastructure in Brooks, even after the levy account pays for a portion of the front ending that it owes the city, there is still another $365,000 of front ending that the city must collect from developers via future offsite levy rates. And that is built in to the rate calculation in the Corvus model. No matter what the position of the reserve today, and this I'm now looking at the graph at the bottom of the slide, and what this graph is showing you is the anticipated balance in the city's water levy account over the 25-year review period. And you can see in some years it is positive, and in some years it is negative. Why is it negative in some years? Because those are years when front-ending is going on. No matter what the ups and downs look like in an individual levy account, we know one thing specifically, and that is at the end of the review period, at the end of 25 years, the levy account has to be back to balance. It must be at zero. And you can see that the rates have been adjusted to ensure the water levy account in Brooks gets to zero at the end of 25 years. The reason that must occur is because the city is not allowed to make any money off the developers in this exercise. It can't be positive. Likewise, it can't be negative. There can't be a gap in financing. The developers have to pay for their specific share. At the end of the review period, it must be exactly back to zero. So the Corvus model will adjust the rates as needed, a little bit up or a little bit down, to ensure that the reserve or the account gets back to balance at the end of the review period. And it does that all while building in the interest impacts that have to occur. You recall earlier when I talked about the legislation in Alberta and the MGA and the requirement for providing interest. Well, in this account, anytime there are positive account balances, they earn interest, and any time there are negative account balances, they are charged interest. And these balances account for those ups and downs. So that is a summary of the water infrastructure, and I'll show you the water rate here a few slides away once I take you through the other three types of infrastructure. However, as I said a moment ago, now that you see how water works, and I took you through that in detail, I'm going to go much more quickly now through sewer, storm, and roads, because the process is exactly the same. The methodology is exactly the same. The only thing that changes is the projects themselves, obviously, and the costs associated with those projects. So what does the sewer infrastructure, offsite sewer infrastructure look like in the city of Brooks? Well, there are 16 sewer offsite levy projects in the city of Brooks. Again, just like water, some of those have been constructed already, and some of those will be constructed in the future. And the total cost of this infrastructure is just over $53 million. Now let's follow that through to see how much of that $53 million actually finds its way to rates. Once again, we have to remove any special grants or contributions that either have been received or will be received. And there are about $16.3 million of those. That leaves us with a net amount of about $37.5 million. However, a portion of those costs will benefit existing development in the community. This is the city share of the project, if you will. That totals just over $23 million. Once again, there is no costs that are allocated to any other municipalities. It's these two gray boxes that represent the costs allocated to future development. There is a portion of the cost, just a little bit shy of $2 million, that is the developer's share, but is beyond our 25-year review period. And there is about $12.5 million of sewer infrastructure that is allocated that benefits future development that is within our 25-year review period. We also, though, have to acknowledge and subtract any levies that have been collected up to this point in time, up to the end of 2020, that being about $2.6 million. So of the $53 million in total infrastructure costs for sewer, about $9.9 million is allocated to future development and finds its way into our rate calculation now. Let's look at stormwater next. On the storm side, there are five projects actually. The slide is incorrect at the top. It says 3. There are 5 projects. And in terms of numbering, just so folks aren't confused, you can see that these projects are numbered 13 through 17. There are other projects also in there, but either have been removed from the city's project list for various reasons, either merged with other projects, paid for, or what have you. These are the 5 projects that are built into the rate calculations. They're all future projects and they total about $4.3 million. Now, of that $4.3 million, how much flows through to the developers and to rates? Well, we have to subtract grants and contributions again, but there are none. So the total is 4.3, but of that, about $2.5 million is for the benefit of existing development in the community. The balance is allocated to future developers. However, about $750,000 is beyond our review period, beyond the 25 years, leaving about $1 million within our review period. Up to this point in time, the city has collected about $400,000 of stormwater-related levies. So when we subtract that, that leaves a balance of about $650,000 upon which our rates are constructed for stormwater infrastructure in the city of Brooks. The last infrastructure type is transportation related off-site infrastructure. There are just 3 projects that you can see listed here. 2 of those have already been constructed. 1 is for the future. Together, they total about $5.6 million. Once again, I'll just repeat it. And we're only dealing with off-site infrastructure here, so the arterial road network. Again, on-site infrastructure is constructed and paid for by developers and then turned over to the city. We're only dealing with off-site infrastructure in the bylaw here. So of that $5.6 million, quite a bit in grants and contributions have either been received or will be received, about $3.5 million. Leaves a balance of 2, of which a portion of that, about $1.2 million, will be for the benefit of existing development in the community. That will be the city share. None allocated to other municipalities. Again, the 2 gray boxes represent those costs allocated to future developers. However, there is a portion, about $200,000, that is beyond our review period. About $550,000 finds its way into our review period. However, transportation is rather unique in Brooks. It's already collected more than what it needs for this specific infrastructure that we're dealing with here, but about 640,000 collected already. So we actually have a negative amount, if you will, that's due. Now, that amount, as you'll see, will ultimately stay in the levy accounts, whatever is left ultimately, and that will be applied to future projects when they enter. Remember that there is another portion of cost which is not in rates today, not in our 25-year review period, which will find its way into our review period next year and beyond. And so this amount that you see, this negative amount, will be applied to those as well. Okay, well, with that as an overview of the numerator of the rate calculations in Brooks, all of the infrastructure costs, what I'm now going to do is a quick summary now, and then talk a little bit about the rates themselves. So the table at the top, if you look at the far right-hand column, you can see for all 4 infrastructure types in the city of Brooks, there's nearly $100 million of infrastructure cost that is either being constructed already or will be constructed in the future. And that will be paid for about $25 million via special grants and contributions. The municipality's share of that infrastructure will be about just under $46 million. And then the developer's share comprises these last 2 columns here. However, about $7.6 million of that is beyond our review period, and therefore not in our rates, but about $21.3 million of that $100 million is allocated to developers and does form the basis of rates in the city of Brooks. Down at the bottom there, a quick summary of the account balances. I walked you through the water account balance specifically and the deficit of $365,000. That represents front-ending that is still owed to the city of Brooks for water infrastructure. The other 3 account balances are actually in a positive balance. They're in surplus. Transportation just shy of 200,000, sanitary infrastructure just shy of 1.6, and stormwater infrastructure just shy of 3.8 million. And those balances, by the way, are balances after any front-ending obligations have been paid to the city of Brooks. So the city of Brooks in a number of these categories actually has balances that are higher than this, but do not include the front-ending obligations that are due to the city. And the model, of course, calculates those and ensures that the city is repaid those balances. And when they are, you can see the total balance, at least at the end of 2020, is about $1.8 million in surplus in total. Now, what does all this mean in terms of offsite levy rates? Well, first of all, I want you to look at the table in the bottom. The table in the bottom shows the rates for all of the areas. There's 25 areas I mentioned. These are listed down the left-hand side, and you can see the rates for each of those 25 areas. Some are a little higher, some are a little lower. This depends on what infrastructure is allocated to and benefits each one of those areas. Not all areas pay the same rate because they don't all benefit from the same infrastructure. But overall, and this is the table that is on top, overall, the weighted average rate for levies in the city of Brooks is just shy of $80,000 per hectare. Now, we just show that to you for information only. Developers don't pay $79,823 per hectare. They pay the rate that is specific to their area. But this rate is useful to understand what the average is and to be able to sort of see what that means in terms of other municipalities as well. At the back of the Corvus report in one of the appendices, you'll also see this particular table. This is a comparison of that updated offsite levy rate, the average rate for the city of Brooks, to other municipalities, cities across the province and other municipalities of similar size and the like. When I started this project, knowing what the population is in the city of Brooks, how big it is, I would have anticipated that the levy rates would have been somewhere around $100,000 per hectare. If they were a little higher than that, then I would start to get a little concerned. But as you can see, they're well below at $80,000 per hectare. This is quite good for a community the size of the city of Brooks, and sort of puts Brooks in the bottom tier, if you will, lower tier compared to other municipalities. And there are some municipalities on this list that are much larger, obviously, than Brooks itself. But as I say, for a community the size of Brooks, we would anticipate normally a rate of somewhere around $100,000 per hectare. So with that, I am going to now pause, and I would be happy to take any questions that members of the public or members from the county might have about the offsite levy situation in the city of Brooks. Wow, it can't be that easy. There have to be some questions. Jeff, Maria from the County of Newell, did you have any other questions at all? How the city project was undertaken, or how the rates were calculated?
No, I think you did a great job of explaining it, Greg. And honestly, Maria and I were here solely for our own education. And like I say, I think you provided a lot of great information that we can take back to our municipality and ponder.
Okay, no problem. Well, I won't push it any further then. If there are no other questions from Jeff or Maria, what we can do is we can adjourn the formal part of the meeting, allow Jeff and Maria to depart. I believe the meeting is being broadcast, and so we can end that broadcast now. And once that broadcast is done, we can then have a bit of a private session